Hello, everybody. We are Gabriela and Paola from S in English, and we are very happy today to be here with the great Scott Thornbury. Scott is a teacher and educator with over 40 years experience in English language teaching and an MA from the University of Reading. His experience includes teaching and teacher training in Egypt, UK, Spain, where he now lives, and in his native New Zealand. He's written several award-winning books for teachers on language and methodology, as well as authored a number of papers and book chapters on language and language teaching. He is series editor for the Cambridge Handbooks for Teachers, and he was the co-founder of the Dogme ELT group. He's also a trustee of the HandsUp Project, which promotes drama activities in English for children in under-resourced regions of the Arab world. So thank you very much, Scott, for accepting our invitation.
My pleasure.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Thank you very much. So you initiated, as Gabi said before, the Teaching Unplugged or Dogme approach and movement. And we see that the way in which CSE, comprehensive sexuality education, can be implemented and what the Dogme approach proposes have something in common, and that is that they provide space for learners' voice. But before we move on to these elements that they have in common, we would like to ask you about Dogme, right? Can you briefly explain us what Dogme proposes?
Yeah, well, I mean, to give you a very brief history, when I was a teacher trainer on in-service and pre-service courses here in Barcelona, it was back in the 1990s, it was apparent to me and my colleagues who were trainers that although we subscribed to a communicative approach, and although the trainee teachers themselves were said that they were committed to this approach, we didn't see a great deal of real communication happening in the classrooms we were observing. And it seemed that as we thought about it, that one of the reasons, the problems was there was the kind of classroom space was cluttered, literally and metaphorically, with stuff, with materials, with activities, with technology, less so then than now, of course. And that there wasn't, the teachers weren't clearing some of this away to create space for the learners to talk about the things that they're interested in, their particular needs, interests, desires, fears, hopes, aspirations, etc. So about that same time, there was a film movement that emanated from Scandinavia, which was rebelling, if you like, against the Hollywood kind of big budget, high tech movie culture that was predominant at the time and still is, of course, more so than ever. And so they sought to create a filmmaking, a cinema that was the bare necessities, that was kind of pared down and that focused on real stories about real people and real places. And they were called the Dogme 95 film movement. Now, I saw an analogy there that I kind of thought was suggestive that this is what we want in English language teaching. We need to, get back to the bare essentials. And so I wrote an article in year 2000. It came out in a IATEFL journal, and it generated a little bit of interest. So we started a discussion group online where a number of teachers around the world shared ideas about how this could be realized, a kind of stripped down materials light pedagogy, not relying on course books, not relying on the traditional grammar syllabus, but generated by the interest and the needs of the. And of course, there's a long history to this kind of approach. I mean, you only have to go back to the 1970s, 1980s, when the communicative approach was, the new flavor of the month, as it were, and to see that various scholars were proposing alternatives to the kind of course book driven grammatical syllabus. And there was the idea of the process syllabus was generated by the people in Lancaster, that the syllabus should be negotiated with the learners, and so on. So as I said, there's a long history. So anyway, to cut a long story short, we attracted quite a lot of interest, quite a lot of criticism, understandably, from the establishment, if you like, the ELT establishment. And but nevertheless, the online discussion ran for about 10 years or so, and generated a great deal of, great volume of discussion and very interesting practical ideas, as well as kind of theoretical origins, etc. The discussion has kind of migrated now into other places like social media. In 2009, one of the original co-founders of the group, Luke Meddings, and I produced a book called Teaching Unplugged, where we attempted to kind of rebrand, if you like, Dogme, because dogma, the word has got such negative associations. So Teaching Unplugged was what we wanted people to think about it and think about it positively, not as something that was anti-course book necessarily, but was pro-learner, if you like. And so we kind of, we suggested activities that even inexperienced teachers, or teachers teaching children, or teachers teaching beginners, etc., could implement in their classrooms, irrespective of their context. And that was over 10 years ago. Interestingly enough, very recently, I've started doing courses again, training courses for experienced teachers in Dogma principles, because there's a felt need, I think, still, and particularly now with technology kind of encroaching on the classroom, or classrooms having moved online, there's a real need, I think. A lot of people saying, well, how can we rescue that real interaction that was so valuable in the classroom, and how can we transpose it into an online environment, for example? So I've been all of a sudden, doing lots of talks, seminars, and short courses about dogma again. So this is kind of interesting that 20 years on, it still seems to have a certain traction, as it were.
Yeah, it's still relevant. So one of the key principles that Teaching Unplugged proposes, or Dogme proposes, is, as I said before, to provide space for learners' voice, right? So what does this mean, really? And why is it so important to give space, to provide space for learners' voice, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. There's pedagogical reasons. And I mean, English language teaching, even before the communicative approach, recognized the value, the importance of letting learners practice, that learning a language wasn't just learning the rules of the grammar, for example, but it was actually activating these in the classroom. So, that's one literal meaning of giving learners voice. It was through production activities where students did kind of fluency work through role plays and discussions and so on. But that's not really what we mean, I think, by voice in this sense. I think by voice, giving the learners a voice is recognizing that their agency in the learning process is very important and needs to be foregrounded in the interests of their motivation, apart from anything else, but also in their long-term learning, to provide them a degree of autonomy after the classroom experience is over. And so they need to have their voice recognized, and voice meaning here, everything that they want to do with the language that they're learning, and also to use that language to project an identity, not necessarily their first language identity, but an identity that is they feel is appropriate for the context in which they'll be using the second language, in this case, English. But also, of course, within the classroom dynamic, sharing learners' voices is a great way to build rapport and trust between the learners. And trust, I think, is a kind of basic element of any educational context. So people need to trust the teacher needs to trust the learners, and the learners need to trust each other. And building that kind of community can only really be done if learners are given a degree of agency and they are heard. And I think that's the other important thing. It's not just about giving learners a voice. We can do personalization activities in the classroom, say talk about, what you did last weekend. But if we don't listen, we're not really giving them voice. So it's a two-way process. And I think it's all about how the teachers themselves, training themselves to listen to the learners, to give them the space, to give them the opportunity to bring their own lives into the classroom, but to listen and respond to that genuinely, authentically, not as a teacher, but correcting them all the time, or saying, good, good, very nice, lovely, but by really engaging with the learners. And I think that's fundamental. And also you, as a teacher, if you're listening to the learners, you're modeling the process of listening so the other learners hopefully will also listen to one another.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. Listening actively, ready to give an answer, but a concerned answer, in fact.
Yes.
No, sorry.
Go on.
Okay. In the last couple of years with Pau, we have recurrently been visiting your blog, AZ in ELT, as we think that some or many actually of the entries are related to CSE content or are, CSE content. And we would like to ask you about some of them. And to start with, we would like to go to the entry about critical pedagogy, where you quote Alastair Pennycook when he says, taking a critical approach to TESOL does not entail introducing a critical element into a classroom, but rather involves an attitude, a way of thinking and teaching. And you summarize this quote by saying that a critical teacher teaches with attitude, right? So what does it mean in the context of critical pedagogy to teach with attitude, and why is it necessary?
Yes, I mean, I think what Pennycook is saying in that quote is not enough just to kind of introduce critical content or, political content or current affairs or whatever into the classroom. It's the way that you deal with this content, but any content really, I think, and this comes back to my point about listening. That's one thing, but also I think it's, the attitude of the critical attitude. And I would say kind of the attitude of a dogma teacher too, includes things like natural curiosity and interest in the learners, but also it involves, I think, problematizing. This is Paulo Freire's term, dealing with problems and confronting problems and talking about problems, not, the learner's problems, but also recognizing that the materials, the syllabus, the educational culture itself is not without its problems. And so these need to be interrogated, as we do with course books, examining course books, for example, or any classroom materials for their sort of hidden agenda, as it were. What is it that they're saying? How are they positioning the learner? What are they not saying? What are they leaving out? And so on. So I think the attitude involves a degree of subversiveness, if you like. I think, a lot of teachers on the Dogme discussion list recalled experiences where they were kind of something the students said, or some kind of clash between what was in the curriculum and what the students actually needed. They saw this as being problematic, and it led them to question their methodology. I mean, we've all been, I think, in that situation where something's made us think, oh, why didn't that work? That just went down so badly with this group of learners. Since that, what is it that I'm not doing here or I'm doing wrong? And I think as a teacher trainer, you're very well aware of those experiences and watching teachers who are doing things quite differently from what you might expect them to be doing, but very successfully. And that also makes you think, hang on, it's not all about how I was trained to teach the language. There are multiple possibilities for learning and teaching. What one writer, Kumarama Divalu, called a pedagogy of possibility, that we want to open up the possibilities. And one way of doing this is through what's called in mainstream education exploratory talk, or some writers call it dialogic inquiry. It's in contrast to pedagogic talk. Pedagogic talk in the language classroom is all about, what's the past of go, went, good, that kind of, rhetoric. Whereas exploratory talk aims to engage in a kind of dialogic process among equals, if you like. So there's no hierarchy necessarily between the teacher and the learners in that sense, that we're talking about issues, we're exploring issues, we're reading and writing about issues, and we are wondering about them, and we're asking questions about them, and we're not presupposing that there's any, answers to a lot of these issues. It's very much rooted in the Freirean idea of a critical or dialogic pedagogy. It's what Claire Crampsch called, notably, another way of being a teacher, which again reflects that Pennycook quote, I think, a different attitude, if you like. I would also say, however, that there are problems here that with language learners, particularly beginners or elementary learners, it's one thing to say, yeah, we should be problematizing the content, we should be discussing issues with a kind of critical eye. But if the language learners don't have the level, the English, the resources linguistically to do this, it can be very frustrating. So I think we need to be careful that we don't push learners into a position where they're being made to talk about things which are beyond their actual linguistic capacity. That would be frustrating. So I think, we have to balance the need to introduce content into the classrooms, which is topical, relevant, even transformative, but at the same time, we have to balance that with the capacity the learners have to kind of engage with, even understand it. There is a tension there that I need to kind of flag that.
Yeah. Yes. What we do here sometimes is when students have this need to reflect upon these issues, these CSE issues, and they don't have the linguistic means to do so, we resort to our L1 because our classes are monolingual. So there is space for reflection. There is space to problematize, as you said, to restive problematize the contents of the book or society itself. And we do that in the L1. And then, we move on to teaching the L2, but there is a space for reflection because, as you said, that's really, really important. Now we would like to ask you about another an article that you wrote in 2009, which is really, really interesting. It's called Window Dressing versus Cross-Dressing in the EFL subculture. Many years ago. You wrote that many years ago, but still relevant today. And in that article, you say that, for example, in Spain, so long as you make passing reference in the teacher's book to the temas transversales that we all know, everybody is happy. And this generally, this passing reference to these temas transversales can mean tokenism, right? So our question is, 21 years later, right, in 2020, have there been any changes as regards the inclusion of these topics such as human rights or gender equality, as you see it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because that experience that I was in a sense referencing was when I was writing course books for UK-based publishers, but course books to be used here in Spain, and one of the criteria for the course book brief was that the content of the course book, the English language course book, should be flagged or correlated with the temas transversales in the secondary syllabus. And so but it was very, very, as I say, it was very tokenistic. It was like, one of the temas transversales is road safety. So, well, this unit, there's a picture of somebody crossing a road at a zebra crossing. That will do, and it's not. And as for, and road safety is one thing, but issues of gender equality, etc., were only, again, tokenistically addressed. You can change the illustrations to be more inclusive or less stereotypical in terms of roles, gender roles, etc. But I mean, what does that achieve really? And I don't know whether it's changed a great deal. I mean, I was looking, your question prompted me to go online to see in Spain if the temas transversales themselves have changed. And they haven't really. I mean, they're basically, revolve around the same issues: health education, peace education, the environment, of course, the consumer, equality, and road safety. Now, in terms of the way that the course books and the curriculum are integrating this, I imagine that it's less tokenistic, but I don't know. But I think the big development, of course, since I was writing course books, is content and language integrated learning. That is CLIL. And I know that, that's happening not just in Europe, but all around the world, where learners are learning their course, their school subjects in the second language. And therefore, theoretically, at least, they're getting the benefit of both. I mean, the subject knowledge and the second language experience. When it works, it seems to work very well, but it does assume, again, coming back to this point about, talking about critical issues, it assumes a kind of critical mass of linguistic ability before you can do geography or biology or history or whatever in the second language. And there's, of course, another stream educational movement that has run alongside the notion of temas transversales, and that is kind of values education, which is implicit in some of these temas, of course, things like gender equality and also education for peace. But values education is a two-pronged sword, because it just depends whose values are you actually promoting. And you can, this notion of values education can be interpreted in a very reactionary way, where the values that are being pushed or promoted through the education are very conservative and traditional ones. So there's another tension here. There's the tension between, Diane Ravitch, who's an American educator, writes about this in the textbooks in the States. There's two kind of diametrically opposed tensions that are impacting on the design of course books and actually reducing the teacher's agency. And one is the kind of the impact of traditional values. So you can't have a picture of a child with their baseball cap on back to front, because it represents social rebellion or whatever. At the same time, there's the more liberal values that are often called pejoratively values of political correctness, which are demanding inclusiveness in the materials. And so you have, on the one hand, you have illustrations of women doing non-traditional feminine kind of roles or jobs, like driving buses or being plumbers or whatever, which is a bit tokenistic, but nevertheless. And then you have the impact of the traditional values, which control the content and reduce anything that's likely to be disturbing or antisocial or whatever. So it seems to me, in English language teaching materials, we do, anyone I speak to who's in publishing, who's writing materials now, is always reports feeling very, very constrained by what they can say and what they can't say. You've got all these different forces impacting on you, and that really limits the possibilities of the current materials and curricula, which is maybe another reason is where you can, of kind of moving those materials to one side, if it's possible in your teaching context, and working with what it is that the learners want to say and want to do with their English.
Yes. Sometimes we have the possibility of creating our own material, but as you said, it depends on the context. Sometimes teachers are not allowed to create their own material and they have to use a certain course book. Yes. Okay. Another question related to the same article that Paul mentioned, window dressing versus cross dressing. In this article, you also mentioned this exploitation that exists on the part of the global marketing of English, of the addictiveness of grammar. You say that form is safe, it sells books, it is marketable. Don't rock the boat seems to be the message from publishers. What could be the dangers of becoming addictive to grammar?
Yes, don't start me. I mean, one of the reasons I think in that article I was saying that because people want to avoid controversial issues, the publishers do, and the institutions do, the ministries do, etc. So the content of English language teaching materials tends to be rather bland, if you like, or anodyne. And in fact, that article I wrote, I was invited to write that by another so-called humanist educator, Mario Rinvolucri, who was writing an article about that very problem, about the kind of the blandness of English language teaching materials, the uncontroversial nature of them, etc. And there's reasons for that, as I said. And what tends to happen, I think, is that because there's no content, if you like, to English language teaching. I mean, there's no, unless you're doing English for specific purposes, like, you know, for legal English or banking English or academic English or whatever, then there is content that you can integrate into the teaching process, as in CLIL. But traditionally, at least, for general learners of English, there is no content. So the grammar, in a sense, becomes the content. So today, today we're going to do the present perfect continuous. Not today we're going to talk about equal rights, or today we're going to talk about climate change, or today we're going to talk about whatever. It's today we're going to do the present perfect continuous. The grammar, in a sense, fills the space that's been vacated because there is no subject. And I think that's one reason. And why you ask, you know, what are the dangers of that? Well, one of the dangers is that because grammar is represented as a series, if you like, of discrete items. You know, today is the present perfect, next week it's the third conditional, next week it's this and the other, phrasal verbs, whatever. There's a tendency to kind of teach these discrete items as if they were, in a sense, that was all that language is. You know, if you learn all these pieces of grammar, then magically one day you'll be able to speak and write fluent English. We know that that's not the truth. There's a lot more to language than grammar. I mean, there's vocabulary for a start, but there's also discourse, putting it all together in connected text, whether spoken or written. So language is multidimensional. It can't be reduced to just one system. And let alone a system that's sort of easily divided up into these bite-sized units, which in turn encourages a kind of transmissive educational pedagogy, you know, transmitting. Today we're going to do the present perfect continuous, whether you like it or not, whether you need it or not, whether you're ready for it or not. Yeah, but that's what's on the syllabus. I'm the teacher. I have the knowledge. You're the empty vessel. I'm going to transmit that knowledge into your empty brain, and you're going to be grateful and fluent, and it just doesn't happen like that. And of course, it also encourages a focus on accuracy. You know, when you're teaching grammar, it's all about getting it right, and conformity and rules. And, you know, that's not how language is realized in the world. It's not about accuracy or conformity or rules. It's often about creativity and breaking rules. And it's certainly more about fluency for most learners than it is about accuracy, especially adult learners are never going to achieve a native-like accuracy, nor do they need to, either in grammar or pronunciation or whatever. So this focus, this addictive focus on grammar, seems to really narrow the pedagogy of possibility. It reduces it to a list of structures, what I've called elsewhere grammar McNuggets, because they're like chicken McNuggets, they're easily deliverable, they're easily consumed, and what's really important, of course, they're easily tested. Much easier to test a student's knowledge of the rule of the third conditional than it is to test their ability to talk about the things that matter to them. So yeah, there's so many things wrong with the traditional grammar syllabus that, as I say, I mean, I could go on, and I do go on, so I better shut up.
No, that's fantastic. That's so interesting. As you were talking about this, I was thinking about this idea of grammatical chronology. It's not just teaching discrete items, right? But in a certain order, as if that was what our students needed actually to communicate. So there is a lot to discuss there. And well, there is a lot to be done still, because we still see some teachers still seem to be comfortable teaching that way. And well, as we know, everything that moves us outside our comfort zone, it's kind of hard at the beginning, but it's great to be talking about this because it helps a lot to make a change. So coming back to your blog, which we love, that Gabi was talking about before, there is another entry we would like to ask you about, and that is about the entry about sexist language, where you refer to the invisibility of women in the Spanish language that has, of course, we know, male as default. And in this respect, there are a number of guidelines for the use of non-gendered and inclusive language. And well, here, particularly in Argentina, there are debates over the use of non-gendered language, and some people get furious. They get angered, irritated, crazy about the use of this language. So why do you think there is such strong resistance?
I mean, there's always resistance everywhere to language change or suggestions of language change from the traditionalists, and sometimes with good reason. We can't just be changing language for the sake of changing it from one day to the next. In fact, language change doesn't happen like that. Permanent language change tends to happen sort of from the bottom up. It's not imposed. But nevertheless, there is a lot of anguish generated when anybody suggests that, for example, we regender or degender language. And I mean, it happens in English too, of course. And English is actually relatively lucky in some ways compared to Spanish being not as gendered. I mean, we don't have gender in our nouns, adjectives, etc. But we do have gendered personal pronouns, he, she, they, etc. And of course, as you well know, there's been a lot of debate, a lot of controversy in the last 10, 15 years as to how these pronouns, the use of pronouns, positions people into gender stereotypes or pigeonholes that they don't necessarily identify with, particularly trans people. And so now it's customary in many educational contexts, not just educational contexts, many contexts, to invite people to choose their preferred pronoun, where they want to be known as he or she or they, or some other new invented combination. So this is going on in English, and just as you're experiencing in Argentina, it creates a lot of reactionary debate. So question, I think the interesting question is, is it true that the gendered nature of language, which has a long historical background, of course, and although people deny that gender is related to sex, in many cases it clearly is, does it actually affect the way that people think? And this is an interesting area of research into psycholinguistics and culture, etc. If you speak a gendered language like Spanish, for example, or highly gendered language, does it give you a kind of stereotypical view of the world as divided into men and women, and that women tend to be associated with, or the feminine gender is associated with certain kinds of things, whereas the masculine gender is associated with other ones? And that, I'm not an expert in this research, but there does seem to be evidence that it does position you towards a kind of particular view of the world, which supposedly, if you come from a non-gendered language like Chinese or English, you don't have. But who knows? But yes, it's going to be controversial. Anything you do with the language is going to be controversial.
Okay, I have one more question before we finish. In the same entry about critical pedagogy, you mentioned that an option materials writers have. Yes, you mentioned that when you wrote that, you were also writing materials. But you said that material writers have this option of introducing topics and texts that have some transformative potential. Okay. And we mentioned also that some teachers create their own material, design their own material. What do you mean by transformative potential?
Well, I mean, I guess in a sense, this is one of the issues that was debated a lot on the Dogme discussion board. To what extent is can Dogme claim to be a critical pedagogy? And one of the criteria, if you look at the literature on critical pedagogy, is it has a transformative value. That is, it has the potential, the educational experience has the potential to change people's lives for the better, or give them the tools to change their lives for the better. Now, clearly, many people are learning English for potentially transformative or aspirational purposes to improve the quality of their life. It's not just that they can read Charles Dickens or whatever. I mean, that would improve the quality, but the material quality of your life will be improved. Supposedly, if you learn English, that you'll get a better job, or you'll be able to go to XY university, etc. You'll be able to emigrate and so on. So in that sense, languages have transformative potential. I think there's another sense, though, because as an individual, to what extent does the experience of the language class or learning the language and using the language transform you as a person? And of course, again, you could say that, you know, extra languages are extra skills, whether or not you use them for pragmatic material purposes, and extra identities even, that they're good for you. You know, that's always been the kind of view of language learning, learn languages for their own sake. But I think I like to think of, and this is why I suppose one of my problems with course books, transformative as also offering marginalized individuals the possibilities of a degree of agency and autonomy, and not remain forever on the fringes. And I think this is where the materials can help by not by being more inclusive and by not essentializing, that is, or othering particular groups of people, or not creating a kind of them and us culture of it. There's quite a lot of interesting research being done into ESL materials, this kind of aspirational culture that they project, the idea of the immigrant who aspires to improve their life by moving to Canada or whatever. And that involves, of course, learning English. And so you get these immigrant success stories are written, these narratives that are written into a lot of course book materials. Here is poor X, he came from Vietnam. He struggled to get to the West, he got into Canada, and then he got a job and he got respect and money and so on and so on. And that narrative is perpetuated in these kinds of materials. But of course, the immigrant experience is not like that necessarily. And it's often much more problematic and in some cases less successful. So I think we need to recognize that, and this comes back to my point about problematizing. We need to look at these stories and say, well, hang on, you know, who wrote this? How does it position the learner, etc. And that again that's that attitudinal thing, the critical eye, if you like, looking at materials, looking at pedagogy, looking at methodology, and saying, you know, how does this position the learner? How much agency does it give them? That's one of the problems with, you know, with the grammatical syllabus too. That, I mean, it assumes that because today is Tuesday, it's appropriate to teach the present perfect continuous, but it doesn't. Where is the learner in this? Where is the learner's choice? Where is the learner's level? Where is the learner's aptitude, etc., and motivation and so on? So, you know, how do you factor in these different aspects of the learning, of the classroom experience? So And I mean, also related to that, I guess, is with the materials is who's not represented. The article I wrote, the window dressing one, was all about gay invisibility or LGBT invisibility in course books, which hasn't actually changed in 20 years. But also, I mean, where are the working class people in course books now? They don't fit into this narrative of sort of aspiration, of consumerism, of travel and shopping and so on. These people are written out. And so I think to be truly transformative, materials and pedagogies have to be more inclusive, and they have to give the learner, whether marginalized or not, the voice we were talking about right at the beginning. And not only the voice, but the voice that is heard.
Yes, definitely, definitely. Sometimes, as you said before, we don't have the opportunity of creating our own materials, right? That really depict society as it is, but we do have as teachers the opportunity of problematizing, right? The contents and the view of the world that the course books present us with. So to round off, we would like to ask you a question that we ask all our guests, and it has to do with social justice. We would like to ask you how, in your opinion, everything that we have been discussing today contributes to social justice. And with this, we finish.
Yes, well, I mean, I hope it's at every level, the level of the materials that we use in the classroom or we choose, whether we just make them ourselves, whether we find them online, whether the learners bring to the classroom themselves, should be inclusive, and should, if they are not, or if they do project a narrow view of the world of society, then they should be challenged, interrogated. So there's no problem bringing in materials, In fact, it's very good, I think, to bring in materials that are written from a completely different alien point of view, like a party political broadcast from somebody from from the far right or whatever, and then unpack all the assumptions that are in that kind of fact-checking, critical reading sort of approach, I think is very good. We shouldn't necessarily be presenting to our learners a diet solely of stuff that they're going to agree with. I mean, that doesn't give them a voice, because voice means the ability to disagree just as much as it is to agree. So on the one level, it's about the materials. And another level, it's about the pedagogy. That social justice is more likely to be achieved in a classroom dynamic where everybody feels that their voice is respected. Doesn't mean that they have to agree with each other, but their voice is respected. They're given the chance for their voice to be heard, and where there is mutual trust, which again is something that takes time to develop. It's even harder, in fact, to develop this kind of community sense, or the small culture of the classroom online now, where we're all teaching, than it is in real classrooms. The physicality of the classroom is obviously a very important asset. We have to kind of replicate that contact, that interaction online now, and work very hard to do that. But social justice, it's small steps, isn't it? If you, in the small culture of the classroom, if there is seen to be a degree of equality, trust, respect, then maybe that this can be carried outside the classroom. People learn to think differently, think less narrowly, perhaps. And I think this is particularly important in teaching younger learners, because you are, in a sense, modeling the kind of behaviors and thinking that you want them to orientate towards in the real world and in their future education. It's less easy to change the kind of mindset of adults because they're so much more fixed. But things happen in classrooms. I think we've all had experiences where there's been a kind of a breakthrough, where somebody said something which has been offensive, and the teacher or even another student has said, no, I'm not letting that pass for whatever reason. And that's something we may need to discuss. And so you are, in a sense, modeling the kinds of, as I say, thinking and behaviors that are conducive to social justice.
Yeah, definitely. When we first contacted you You said that you didn't have much, you felt you didn't have much to say about the topics we are interested in, right? But I think we could listen to you for hours, because everything you have talked about today at some point are related with comprehensive sexuality education, or at least the program here in Argentina, because one of its most important goals is to develop critical thinking skills in our students. So definitely you have a lot to say about this, and we are really, really happy that you accepted our invitation. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for sharing everything you know, because you know a lot about a lot of different topics. You're like an encyclopedia of ELT. Well, that's why you have your AZ of ELT. Well, again, thank you very much, Scott. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you for these great questions, a great pause. I love having these kinds of discussions. And again, you know, these are discussions that we can have with our learners and our colleagues and our institutions. And I admire you enormously for providing a platform for these kinds of discussions. Again, it's exploratory talk. We're coming from positions which may be different, both culturally, age-wise, gender, all sorts of issues, but we are finding common ground. And I think, again, that's what language is good for. That's why it's worth having a language that you can share, because without that, we'll always be stuck in our little boxes and being very suspicious of the other. So thank you so much, Gabby. Thank you, Paula, for this opportunity. Good luck with your, your work, the good work that you do. And I hope one day I'll be able to meet you with a mate somewhere in.
Yes.
Of course. Now that we know that you like mate, of course we will talk over some mate. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thanks
you very
everybody,
much.
and my best regards and wishes to all those who will be watching this recording. Thank you.
Okay. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.